You've seen Karate Kid? Every Japanese man over 50 is the same, basically. Mr. Miyagi. 47. So, so Ken, you're welcome to have a seat.
Okay, I will then.
Or you can stand, whatever you prefer.
Sure.
There you go. This is a fireside chat, so mon amour, tu peux dire au monsieur qui est dans la chambre qu'il peut descendre? Alan. So, Ken, you obviously have written a paper called saying that organoids are not conscious yet. So I will ask you, why are we?
Good way to start. So I did write this paper, and it got me into a little bit of trouble because I get questions like that now that I had never really anticipated having to answer. And I think I probably, even before answering, I probably should say a word about my background here, because this is a topic where there's a lot of different expertise in the room, and I think it's worth just sort of mentioning something. Oh, hi, Emery, I'm glad you're here. Big relief to me that I've got a comrade.
You've done it really well.
Yeah. So I want to work my way toward the answer, but let me just, if you don't mind, I'll just give a word of introduction. I don't know most of the people here, so just by saying hello, I want to just say that my background, I was as an undergrad and even a master's degree, I was in English literature, and then I decided there's no way I was going to be an English professor, so I went to medical school a little bit reluctantly, and at the end of medical school, I got just fascinated by neuro for a rather unusual reason. It's sort of, neurology, especially at that time, was full of all these eponymous syndromes. There were all kinds of these different diseases that had these really cool names like Kupelberg-Wieslander and Gerstmann-Straussler syndrome, and there was lots and lots of them, and they just fascinated me. These names, it was like learning mythology when you think about diseases and these really complex polysyllabic names. It was really fantastic. So I got really intrigued by what was behind all these names that were there. This was the essence of neurology, and actually there was one name of one disease. If you collect iron in your basal ganglia, that disease was called Halvorsen spots, and they turned out to be Nazis. So that name was really gotten off the table pretty quickly. But a lot of these names still sit around. So anyhow, as that period came to an end, getting toward the end of neurology training, what I did was to come to the decision that I didn't really want to practice so much, but research really attracted me, and that opened up a long career, which is still going on in research. Actually, in this area, I spent 25 years in the Longwood medical area doing Alzheimer research, cell and molecular biology, and in fact, I'll give a little plug tomorrow. Thanks to Anna here, doing grand rounds at the Brigham on my day job, which is more Alzheimer's disease. But it became apparent, working towards your question,
I'm always trying to cut to the chase. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we're getting to the chase right now. The research led me to these the organoids, because organoids are a really interesting example for a lot of diseases, especially neurodevelopmental diseases, but to some extent neurodegenerative diseases as well. Does anybody need 3 sentences on what a brain organoid is? Yes. Okay. Good. So you're familiar, a stem cell can become any cell in the body. And so we can get human stem cells, we turn them into neurons. And the way people have customarily grown neurons in culture is on a planar surface. And that was what we did, and that's what many labs have done for a long time. And then along came Sasai in Japan, And he did something very remarkable. He put these neurons in culture into a gel called Matrigel that has a very interesting property. It is a liquid. You put a drop of these cells, these stem cells that are neural precursors, into the Matrigel, and then you change the temperature, and it goes from a liquid to a gel. And now the cells start growing in 3 dimensions. And I just think there's an incredible thing that happens when biology discovers 3 dimensions. You know, when you go from single cell organisms to multicellular life, and the same thing happened to these organoids. Now, even though they're only a few millimeters in size, when you cut them open and look at them, they have an uncanny resemblance to the brain. They're not the brain. They have in the past been called mini brains, which is politically incorrect because they are not brains at all. We call them organoids. And but their resemblance is turned out to be very, very useful operationally. So, what was your question again?
So I think you're doing a fantastic job. So I have a lot of questions based on what you just said.
Yeah.
And one of them is, how is this even possible? Basically, in other words, if you start thinking about the developmental plan of a human. So, and again, I just want to sort of preface this by saying, not just that brain organoids are weird and amazing, but so are we. The fact that we have an extraordinary computer growing from a cell every single time. Like, it's amazing that this happens in a dish, but I would say that it's equally amazing, maybe 90% there, that it actually happens even inside the body. The fact that we are rewiring this extraordinary computer every single time. So how much do we understand about the topology, the kinds of signals that are needed? Because we can all sort of imagine that, the genome doesn't have everything, and over evolutionary time we've kind of built up a progeny, if you wish, or a precursor that sort of sets up from the maternal cell all of the anteroposterior, and you sort of have inside, outside, frontal, dorsal, etc., and that this somehow leads to the right patterns of patterning. But the fact that it even works in an embryo is extraordinary.
So the fact that it even works in the organoid is even more extraordinary because...
But only by 10%.
Yeah. What happens when you for the embryo, you have to have all kinds of inductive processes where you have mesoderm and endoderm, and everybody's sort of coming together and they're forming gradients and they're shifting around. But an organoid has only seen one lineage of cells in its whole life. It has only seen this lineage that's leading to glial cells and neurons. And yet somehow it's able, without having all these other inductive properties around it, without having any other types of embryonic cells around it, it knows how to intrinsically not only make the organization of a brain, but as we get into our conversation a little more deeply, I'm going to mention how it even resembles, to some extent, the physiology of a human brain. That is, when I say physiology, I'm talking about the electrical EEG type signals. And so that, I think, once people began to see that organoids can actually create this kind of signaling and create electrical activity, that's where this question became, well, are organoids conscious? And I probably have thought less about consciousness than probably some people in the audience here.
For example, that guy.
We'll get to that. Yeah. But I must say, I had to write this paper because I kept hearing over and over again this question, are they conscious? So the title of this paper, Organoids Are Not Conscious Yet. Because I do think that there is some way in which we can imagine material in a material way that biology and maybe even non-biological systems those materials can be assembled in a way that may create something that resembles consciousness.
So do you think
but the next question will be, what is consciousness? And we can
but also are they at 5%? Are they at 90%? Like, basically you're saying yes, maybe one day, but is that day 20-fold away, or is it like...
Okay, I'll tell you the one experiment that when people talk about the ethics of creating something that could have a human-like consciousness, I think we are pretty far away, but there are experiments I worry about. And that is when you take the organoid, which are made of human cells, having all the synaptic connections and electrical activity of a brain, and you then implant it into a mouse or a rat, and they integrate. And signals now, as this animal is moving around, part of its representational state of the world is being mediated through some human cells. That's now possible, and that's been done. That's been published. That to me is that's where I think we're crossing into some boundaries that are a little.
Not only that, but they start exhibiting capabilities that traditional minds don't have. I mean, that's what's amazing. The fact that you plug in some human material, and there's several possibilities for why that's true. One possibility is that we have uncovered different types of neurons that are able to integrate. The second possibility is that they induce connectivity patterns that are uniquely human. And the third is that there are simply some genes within the same classes of neurons that are sort of exhibiting these. Like, I don't know if you have any insights as to.
I think that's, yeah, I don't think I have any particular insights into how that works. Well, I think the real insight here is that we know that compared to a mouse brain or rat brain, I mean, the human brain is just hugely different. The main thing that happened in the human lineage was that there was expansion of two layers. You know, the human cortex has 6 layers. And when you got to the hominid lineage, when we started to separate from chimps, and then a few more 100,000 years went by, and then there was a lineage that is represented not just by Homo sapiens, but by Neanderthals and Heidelbergensis and Florensis, all these species that you read about that are we're now starting to get some DNA on. They seem to, at least we know this is true for humans, that there's a big expansion of layer 2 and 3. That really is what distinguishes us. So to answer your question, I think what actually begins to perhaps create something that would give us these abstract abilities, consciousness, ability to calculate, compute, all the things that we're probably going to talk about tonight, has to do with the wiring, that's the circuitry that's going on. And I think it's very perplexing that simply implanting a small number of human neurons into an animal brain, you're absolutely right. Can even a small number of human neurons does something at what level to change the behavior a little bit?
Who's having a good time?
I'm just so honored to have Emery here. Let me just say one thing, because at some point we might talk about, because somebody's going to ask the question, like, what is consciousness? We're going to get there. And I'd like to put on the table that one property of consciousness, you're going to certainly disagree, but I think that one property of consciousness is it's the fact that it can be interrupted by anesthetics, which are so specific. The rest of the body works and something interferes with consciousness. I'd really be interested in your opinion.
So Emery, welcome, first of all. It's a huge. Thanks. So Emery has just returned from receiving a presidential medal, which is one of the highest honors for a scientist, and it's truly remarkable that you even accepted our invitation. So Ken and I had started plotting this well before that award, and after you got it, we're like, oh no, he'll never be able to.
I think I'm invited.
So you have shown that anesthesia is not about shutting off the brain. It's about changing the patterns, changing the rhythms. Mm-hmm. And neither too much or too little can, in fact, lead to this state of non-consciousness or unconsciousness, or I don't know how you would be able to define it. So I would love to, of course, learn a little bit about that, and I mean a lot about that. But I would love to also sort of start hearing about these transitions. So you know, we just heard, for example, that Neanderthals and Homo florensis and all of these other hominins have expanded these layers. How much of these rhythms are unique to humans? How much of that is unique to the different sort of neuronal components, if you wish? And related to that, I want to hear about rhythms, and I also want to hear about cell types, because the question is, where does consciousness sit? Is there a consciousness center, or is it just like a sheer scale? Is it a sheer sort of coordination? Is it a sheer wiring? if you could sort of tell us a little bit about what your experiments are telling us about where consciousness ends and begins. And if you could sort of tell us, like, can we point to consciousness? And of course, related questions are, how can we define these limits in artificial systems, in, computational systems, in, non-human species, etc. So anyway, welcome. We'd love to hear something.
Well, where to begin? So let me begin by saying I don't study consciousness. I study unconsciousness.
We have the constructive and the deconstructive.
And just like I have my cell phone here, right? I don't know how this thing works. If I take the battery out, it's not going to work. I put the battery back in, it'll work. So I have a reliable way of creating dysfunction in this phone. So I can have reliable ways of creating dysfunction in the brain and still have no clue of what's going on.
Yeah.
So two things. So the thing that we tried to push in our research, and we have been pushing, it's going to sound very simplistic, but it just shows you how naive the field of anesthesiology. You give anesthesiology more credit than it deserves. Truly.
Well, not the field. I'm giving you credit.
No,
that's plenty deserved.
well, but the problem is that anesthesiologists know very little neuroscience. You're talking about these circuits, and you think, we sit around the OR and we say, oh, well, you're taking out the basic ganglia, or you're affecting the thalamus. Doesn't look like that. I think he's moving. Okay, add a little more muscle. Guys. It's kind of light. All right. We'll turn up the sevoflurane. That's the way it talks.
Like you guys Schwarzenegger playing that role.
Right, exactly. You guys about done? Okay, we'll turn it off. Okay, he'll wake up in a minute. No clue, like where the person's from a neuroscience standpoint. So we're very, very far behind where we should be in terms of, working with our colleagues in what I call clinical neuroscience. So the people do sleep research, people do neurology, people do neurosurgery, or neuroscientists. So realizing that's one of the things that got me interested in investigating this question. So just to add two more sentences to what you said, our thinking is now that so first of all, you need a definition of general anesthesia. The general anesthesia has four components. So you're unconscious, your nociceptive system is not working.
Your what system?
Nociceptive. So this process, your nociceptive system isn't working. The system that turns off pain. And I have to be careful because pain technically means you're conscious and you feel it. Nociception just means that system is working. And you're not moving, so the surgeons can operate, and you form no memories. And you do all that and you keep someone physiologically stable. But if you take those four things by themselves, they can be synonymous with death, and you still will accomplish the same thing. We try to not have that happen.
The operation succeeded, the patient died.
Right, exactly. So again, part of the problem, the definitions really, really matter because anesthesiologists talk in slang, which they use professionally. They'll say the depth of anesthesia. What does that mean? If there are four components, how can you talk about the depth? Makes no sense. Or they'll say, like I said, he's light, or I think he's too deep. What does that mean? They're confusing. In other words, they haven't tried to parse out the neurophys. What's happening?
So what you're saying is that it's not a linear scale; it's like multiple properties.
It's at least four dimensions.
Yeah. But my question is: are they always ordered in the same way? In other words, is there a gradient where this shuts off and this shuts off, or
roughly speaking, there is. So, So for example, let's just talk about propofol. So it's what most used anesthetic. Became very well known with Michael Jackson's demise. He tried to use it to sleep with us. So if you learn nothing else tonight,
don't use it.
Anesthesia is not sleep. It's far away from being sleep. So what happens when you give someone propofol? If you give it very, very slowly, what you'll see is the person will continue to talk to you for a while, and they'll gradually sort of drift off into unconsciousness. And if you're measuring their EEG, you'll see that you'll have decreases in like the sort of the fast activity, which we get, from the cortex. If you give a large bolus to someone, just a whopping dose, you'll see big oscillations right off the bat. And just to go ahead and answer one of your earlier questions. So roughly speaking, what we see in rats and what we see in non-human primates and what we see in humans is roughly the same. So that's why we're using the models for this. So the way I started to get a handle on this, so the neuroscience of anesthesia, was saying, look at what my neurology colleagues do. They diagnose cortical strokes all the time. They diagnose thalamic strokes. They diagnose brainstem strokes. What that means is there are many ways you can turn the brain off. Kind of what I just said here. There are many ways you can turn the brain off. And the question is, how are anesthetics doing that? And I think the answer is just it's disappointing, but at least from the way I see it. We just really create. So here's your brain like right now. It's going 40 minutes. Right? And the parts are communicating, everybody's happy and what have you. Now just think about what happened. The anesthetic drug comes in like propofol, and it working with the inner neurons and the pyramidal neurons starts generating oscillations, which are used in propofol in two frequency bands. One which is about 10 cycles per second, and one which is about 0.4 cycles. So what happens when you do that? So this is where our non-human primates experiments have helped us out a lot, because we can measure the oscillations at the same time we measure the neural activity, see what the neurons are doing. And so when the animal's sitting there like wide awake, it's executing a task, the neurons are spiking at 10 spikes per second. All right, nice and happy, what have you. In that state where you see the large slow oscillations, the neuron spiking activity goes down to a half or 1 spike per second. And across the cortex, you see these what are called up-down states. Neurons fire, they don't fire. Neurons fire, they don't fire. All right, now, 10 spikes per second down to 1/2 spike per second. I bet this person is unconscious. I bet any time in Las Vegas they're unconscious. I don't know how far down you had to go for you to become unconscious, but so we have the sufficient condition. Let me just say it that way. Right? Even for being unconscious, which, as I said, is an easier problem to think about consciousness. And then, as we monitor, we've learned that the 10 hertz oscillation is like an oscillation going back and forth between the thalamus and the cortex. Right? The slow oscillation we think is primarily produced by taking away brainstem activity. And this was known in 1935. Frederick Bremme, who's a Belgian neurophysiologist, did an experiment in cats where he transected sort of the spinal cord from the brainstem. And what he saw was on the EEG, he saw what looked like kind of standard awake EEG. So this part here being connected with that, you effectively had the intact brain. Then he cut a little higher. So he separated, so now brainstem, so from midbrain down the pons all the way down to the spinal cord, separated that from the cerebrum. And he called it the silvo in the sense of brain, the cerebrum. And what he saw then was just large, slow oscillations. So that was the first evidence that told us if you disconnect the brainstem from the cortex or thalamus, you're going to get slow oscillations. And since then, we've learned that in the brainstem down there. So here you have the medulla, you have the pons, you have the midbrain. Out of there come what we call arousal centers. All right, so these are neurons or circuits that go up to the cortex and thalamus, and you might think of them as them keeping you awake. All right, you got to be awake to be conscious, let's say. And then the other processing takes place in the cortex. The thalamus working with the frontal cortex, and with the posterior cortex. So, crudely speaking, the first order, when we think about how consciousness is formed, or at least the way that people who know more about that than I do theorize about it, is you have something that keeps you awake, then you have a system that allows you to then process information. And the question is, like you're saying, how do you actually do that? Well, so I think that's sort of a shallow description of what's happening. I think that only gives us a look at sort of one aspect of what's going on.
There's so much debate about ethics of human versus animal experiments, and we still think that primate experiments might be okay. when sufficiently justified. And, mouse experiments might be okay, like nearly all of the time, etc. So my question is there anything uniquely human about consciousness, or is the way that you're defining consciousness the same thing that you would boot up, I don't know, in a fish or in an amoeba or something like that?
Well, I think there is, but I don't know that I can identify it precisely. But having when you start to anesthetize humans, over the course of years having different experiences, you start to see a lot of different sorts of behaviors. I think the one that people are most paranoid about is being quote unquote under anesthesia. That should never happen.
I think there is something unique about human consciousness. Actually, it's I can't be 100% sure about this, but I think what human consciousness gives us this ability to how should I put this, to abstract in a way that, for instance, we're not just feeling pain, but we identify it as an abstraction, as being pain, and I don't know if that's uniquely human, but I do think that as you go widely across phylogeny, I think that ability to actually take this kind of conceptual level, let's call it sentience, the ability to feel pain and identify it as pain as an abstraction rather than just see your arms bleeding, that is a really important feature. And I think it's I did want to mention this actually now because we're in a some people may think that all us getting together right now and having a discussion about consciousness, some people might say, well, that's a little frivolous, everything we know going on out there. I don't think so. But one of the things that I think is so important about human consciousness is this feature of sort of being able to, if the fact that we can internally know what pain is, from that follows empathy, because now we can actually know what someone else's pain is. And I don't think that many other creatures in phylogeny have that capacity, and yet it's a very key feature of consciousness.
So Ken, there's two ways to argue. One possibility is that we developed cross empathy as a byproduct of having self-awareness. Another possibility is that first, me being able to sort of build a mental state of the other in order to know if they'll attack me, if I should flee or fight, etc. That mental model building on others that I perceive may have actually preceded evolutionarily the self-mental model of now I can, wait a minute, maybe I am one of these creatures and now I have a model for how I am thinking.
But the great value of having that model.
I agree.
Means,
but I don't know if the other follows or precedes.
Yeah.
But I think you can start to see it in lower animals, not just in humans. So, for example, one of the best talks I ever went to was in Australia, and the title was "Do Fish Feel Pain?" Right? And so it was a very simple experiment. You had like an aquarium, and it had a glass plate in the middle. So the fish over here could see what the fish over there were doing. And there are these fish called helper fish. What the helper fish do is they go along and they clean off the other fish, clean off algae and what have you. And some of them have good technique, and some of them have horrible technique. The fish over here watch what the fish over there do. And they avoid the ones that have bad technique. Because they're saying, that could be me.
Yeah.
Right. Another example, magpie. Heckle and Jekyll, for those of you, we know about that.
I have no idea what you just said, magpie.
Magpie, it's a bird. Black and white, yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Right. So you put a magpie in front of a mirror, right? And actually, before you do that, you put a dog in front of a mirror and doesn't care. It doesn't realize there's something there or whatever.
But he sure loves us.
Right. But put a magpie in front of a mirror and then put some red paint on it. He realized that what he saw in the mirror is actually him.
Yeah.
The point is that aspects of these are starting to develop across the the evolutionary scale. And it's not
But
something.
not in a sort of in a polyphyletic way. In other words, it's not
Exactly.
monophyletic.
Exactly. In other words, it just doesn't go like this. You can start to see bits and pieces of this in different places. And I guess that sort of doesn't surprise me because I mean,
But the question, the key question might be like, does it correlate with the ability to learn? So there's different types, there's different lineages of birds that are able to learn, to acquire new songs from culture,
right.
rather than they're born with their song. And my question is, are the lineages that also do learning of either dances or songs also the ones that have this capability for self-awareness?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, the self-awareness is, that's probably one of the key aspects of consciousness. And what I was just trying to suggest is that even in the magpie experiments, right, even in the fish experiments, they do have a bit, they're showing self-awareness. They're saying that's dangerous, or you messed up my my black and white suit. I'm going to clean this red spot off. So in other words, the pieces are starting to form. It doesn't just happen just as soon as you have humans, essentially. That's what we can see from these behavioral experiments. And I think there's sort of more to it than that. I think that being able to recognize self, and like Ken was saying, being able to have empathy and see what others feel. In fact, there's some recent experiments done by Ziv Williams at MGH and Rebecca Sachs in our department at BCS, where they think they've identified sort of portions of the brain that activate, and so they show empathy, basically. They illustrate your.
We should study our presidents.
Pardon?
Absent.
There's this big black spot there. I'm sorry, it's black and orange. So there are elements of these things. And then the quote unquote, mirror neurons, which were discovered, a while back, and sort of, they kind of help us be ourselves and sort of perceive essentially who we are. I mean, I think that's one of the most important elements of consciousness, which I haven't seen come out of these models.
I want to talk about two additional things. One is sleep,
Mm-hmm.
and the other one is, coma might be too far, but maybe accidents or psychiatric disorders, or genetic, like rare genetic mutations, to basically try to sort of get at some of those, like chiseling out.
So let's take sleep. That's the easiest one to start with.
Yeah.
So what is sleep? So we don't entirely understand why we need it, but when we do get it and we get it regularly, we're better off. We're healthier, that's for sure. So it has some sort of health promoting value. We go non-REM, and you do that about every 9 minutes, 4 to 6 times a night. REM is like a very awake state. The brain is quite active. And the non-REM state is slow waves and mostly resting. So you can think of it as like you rest, okay, I'll do some activity. And maybe the activity is pruning circuits, honing memories, those are sorts of the ideas that are put forward. And by doing this, we keep ourselves healthy. I mean, that's, I guess, the best way to say it. We still don't have quite tied down like what sleep is. So there are all sorts of states that you can create. You think of the pathology. It's like people who have, who sleepwalk. I mean, basically get up, walk completely around the house, do very, very purposeful on what they're doing, right? And they're not awake. I mean, they're not awake in the sense, they're awake in the sense that they know exactly what they're doing this. But, you can maybe call to them. Sometimes they will answer, sometimes they won't answer.
And no recollection whatsoever.
Zero recollection. Zero. And I can reproduce that in the operating room.
So it's not just about walking. I mean, I've been known to sort of have entire conversations in my sleep that I'm completely unaware of in the morning. So it's not just like motor activity, like,
Oh yeah,
making jokes, like, and sort of
We should ask Lucille. Nobody did that.
eating.
Yeah, they're abnormal eating behaviors.
Yeah.
Parasomnia.
But
yeah.
again, I think of eating and walking as more animal-like, but talking and sort of making jokes, I think more as human-like. So
Right.
basically, I think that there's some things that we would define as uniquely cognitive
Yeah.
that we can do without even consciousness, if you wish.
Yeah, but not sleep. Because I mean, you made the point right at the beginning that anesthesia and sleep are radically different. You can't put them in
Yeah.
the same category. So even if you're in deep sleep, you're not in REM sleep. We are still aware. You know, most people after they go to sleep for a certain period of time, they have some sense of how much time passed.
Yeah.
So it's not like awareness, and awareness was key to what you described as anesthesia, is still operative during even deep sleep.
Yeah.
So I don't think sleep has anything at all.
So awareness and memory are completely different. In other words, you can be self-aware as I am and always,
Right.
but have no recollection the next day.
Oh, totally. And I can simulate that very easily in the operating room. So see the patient out in the induction area. They're scared out of their minds. You know, say, okay, just give me a second to put the IV in. And as soon as I put the IV in, I'll give you some relaxation. So I give them some midazolam, some benzodiazepine. All right, then you're like, oh wow, yeah, thanks, I really appreciate that.
No, I'm saying speak up.
Oh, I'm sorry. I said, oh, sorry.
No.
Thanks, I really appreciate that. I feel good now. So roll them into the operating room. We're having a conversation now. They're much more relaxed. Put all the monitors on. We induce anesthesia. And go back to see them after the anesthesia is over in the recovery room. And they said, you know, the last thing I remember is when you talked to me outside there.
Yeah.
They have no recollection of what this was.
Very interesting.
You know.
So there's a period of consolidation that if you shut it off, it doesn't even happen.
But you know, it feels like no time has passed. I mean, that's one of the key things. They'll tell you that. Or the other, these are just little factoids that I think are interesting because I think by telling the factoids and telling the clinical stories, we'll eventually put things together. So, you know, everybody knows that, you know, Parkinson's is a disease where you see just dopamine tremors or what have you. It's an unfortunate disorder, and we don't quite know why the cells die out or what have you. But one of the things, you know, and so people think of the tremor as one of the main features of it. But before you see the tremors, you actually see something really interesting. You see these REM episodes where the people wake up in the midst of a dream, but a very violent dream typically.
Oh, wow.
And this is described, you know, in the original writings about, you know, Parkinson's disease. And I think, I mean, so what's happening there? It's like something came uncoupled. You know, there's some sort of control system that came uncoupled. And actually, it was so uncoupled, it appeared to be a threat to the person. They'll wake up like screaming or, you know, like kicking or what have you. And you say, hey, what's up? And they will remember that. That isn't, that's not like this, like.
So in a way, it's a shut off of that separability, basically.
Right, exactly. So that's why I think these pathologies are so important, because each of them gives us a little look, a little piece. And so I think thinking about how to put them together is
So
really
these are large disorders. These are common disorders with, you know, very polygenic
neurodegenerative disorders.
Yeah. But I'm also thinking, I also want to ask you about sort of rare monogenic disorders. Like, how much do we know about the genes that might underlie some of these connectivities? I mean, if nothing, that's a fine answer. I can move
Right.
on.
I mean, for me, you can say zero.
Okay.
Because I enjoy being a clinician. I enjoy watching the symptoms that patients present with, and then trying to decipher them, trying to take them back, you know, to that next level, the wiring diagram. Then after I get the wiring diagram right, then I can turn it over to you guys so you can figure out.
Hallucinations. I mean, hallucinations are like an added level of perception related phenomenon that is linked to some genes like serotonin, 5-HT2A, or
Yeah. So just a little factoid that I just learned a few weeks ago was that, you know, when you look at the early brainstem development, it turns out that serotonin and norepinephrine are the ones that form the largest hub networks initially. And then it's not till later on that you start to see those pathways extend, you know, further out. So there is something, but what's ironic about it is what people have used to treat depression all these years has been basically serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And the best unkept secret in all psychiatry is everybody knows they don't work. And then actually what I think is so cool is anesthesia tells you a little bit why it works. excuse me, what you need to do. Let me say it that way. Because everybody knows about ketamine, right? Ketamine has been used to treat depression now. There are ketamine clinics. I mean, if I want to make an extra $1,000 before I go home, I can do 4 hours in a ketamine clinic, giving people ketamine, and
So for those of you staying after 10 o'clock, we're going to do something.
Put everything with me. So, actually, let's take a step even further back.
Now? Okay,
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
forget ketamine. ECT.
Yeah.
Electroconvulsive therapy. It's still one of the most widely used therapies for treating depression. And have you ever seen it? It's barbaric. It still is very barbaric. And over at McLean's, they do 60 of those a day.
So we have a professor here from McLean. So tell us more about ECT.
So I would wonder what
Brad
you
Rosica.
characterize it as barbaric.
In the sense that when you watch what happens to the person, they get shocked. I mean, they do
Yeah,
this.
yeah, yeah.
I mean,
It's
So-
convulsions, basically.
The
So
way-
stand up,
the way
stand
the
up.
movies- So my name is Brad Rosica. I'm a psychiatrist at Notre Dame. I'm not an ECT doctor, but it's not the way it's portrayed in the movies these days, because anesthesia is used. So a person is unconscious and is paralyzed and does not have a generalized tonic-clonic seizure, but an electrical seizure is in the brain.
well, see, you haven't watched it. See, I've given anesthesia to these patients. I've watched them. There's a whole spectrum of them. There's a whole spectrum of things that you see. The ideal situation is what you're hoping for. But what happens is, I've seen it a number of times, the person is not out, not unconscious before they actually apply the shock a lot of the time.
Wow.
And the reason I know this is I'm watching the EEG. I'm going like, he's not chum. And
You should work with veterans in anesthesiology.
that makes my original point. But you guys aren't watching the EEG. We aren't watching.
Do they report pain afterwards, though? Do they have a recollection of the experience?
No, they usually have no memory of it because you pump more drugs into them. So there's no recall of it.
After the fact?
After the fact, yeah. But what I'm saying, if you actually, two things, watch the EEG. In other words, remember I said start to see the slow oscillation. They're not in slow oscillation, they're still a high frequency oscillation. And because they counted the usual amount of time that they wait after you give the methotrexate, they assume the person's unconscious. Like, same assumption for you, same assumption for me, same assumption for Ken. And a lot of times they aren't.
Yeah.
But what I was about to say was, you do see this seizure activity, which is very, very abrupt. And then what the psychiatrists measure as the effectiveness of the shock was in the post-ictal period, where everything goes quiet.
Mhm.
I mean, it's literally like an electrical defibrillation of the brain.
So Ken, I want to go back a little bit to Alzheimer's and basically start thinking about the loss of self and the loss of identity. And, basically, what does that tell us? Is it sort of that the recent memories are gone and you're kind of living in a state in the past? Is it that like you're not recording anymore, you're not retrieving anymore? Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how it relates to the whole
Yeah,
consciousness?
so because I've thought a lot about it, with anesthesia, you lose consciousness in a moment
With
Perhaps.
certain, you have to be careful with certain
with
anesthetics.
certain anesthetics.
Good.
With Alzheimer's, it's more of a gradual process, obviously. So you could ask the question, what does partial consciousness mean? Because I think that is it just simply a black-white yes-no situation? Or if the Alzheimer patient has lost a lot of their mental faculties, does that mean that their consciousness is also now in some way altered? I don't really think so. I think the Alzheimer patient is conscious. They may not recognize, they may think the fireplace is a toilet, or they may not recognize their wife, but they clearly have some consciousness. I think that family members will tell you that all the time. And now there may be vegetative states and very advanced conditions where we can have that discussion, in a slightly different context. But I think the gradual diminution of a person's cognitive status has not actually altered their fundamental consciousness. And that's part of why we have to treat Alzheimer patients with getting some sense of who they are, what they're thinking, and is their optimal way of getting a quality of life for them. Otherwise, we didn't think they were conscious. I don't think we would, when we like to attribute consciousness to others who are like us. So we very readily can hear that we all can speak. So humans have a lot of affinity for each other, because if you're worried about somebody being conscious or not, you just ask them. And but then we get into a little bit of the question of where does consciousness end in some sort of phylogenetic tree? You can say, well, you can't ask your dog, but you sort of get a sense that they have something that is relating to you. And I think most people would say that you can go pretty far down the phylogenetic tree and still attribute something that resembles consciousness, even though they cannot talk to you. Then you get into the reverse situation where you have a system that can talk to you and relate to you very well, like ChatGPT. And now you have a system there that you would say, oh, this is really resonating with me. Man, you're saying the right thing to me all the time. And that really is now that causes an internal conflict, because they are sounding a lot like us. So this idea of attributing consciousness to some other entity is a big problem. And I don't think that we really have a solution for it to directly answer your question.
So this is the point where I will ask my last question, and then we're going to open it up. So start thinking of your questions. And my last question is trying to get to exactly that you're getting at. So basically, Emery, and I'm going to ask you as well, Ken. So we like to think of consciousness as something that is uniquely human. We like to think of this. We like to think of this uniqueness of our own species, that we have all of these rights, that we want to protect it, that we want that life is extremely precious, that all of these things that we attribute have to do with the extraordinary intellect that we have as a species compared to every other species. The ability to reason, the ability to think, the ability to imagine, the ability to sort of project, sometimes empathy, sometimes, all kinds of mental models that we have of both other humans and sometimes other entities, animals or machines, or you name it. And my question is, I feel that maybe the state of anesthesia or anesthetic-driven loss of consciousness might be too coarse. It might be similar to what you're describing with your cell phone. It's off. And it's the kind of thing that we can put off for many other species. And I'm just wondering, where is that more subtle je ne sais quoi that sort of makes human human consciousness? So basically, if you were to sort of take a stab with everything you've read and learned and done in your own research to define, what would you say defines human consciousness?
Well, again, so this idea that we sort of know self, and that we have some degree of empathy, like with others. But like some of these states, like you were talking about, we can create them by accident with anesthesia. There's one of them, or you see them in
Speak up just a little bit.
in conditions of coma, for example. There's a condition called cognitive motor dissociation. All right. So Adrian Owens did these cool experiments back around the 2000s. He's a neuroscientist, when she had a patient who was in coma. And the family felt that the patient was awake, but there was no overt motor movements or response to the questions that indicated that was the case. So what happened was this person, before having the accident that put her in a coma, used to play tennis. So what they told her was, we want you to think about playing tennis if you want to say yes, and think about walking through the front part of your house if you want to say no. Then what they did was they did fMRI study on people, the movements, what parts of the brain activate when you do the serve, let's say. what parts of the brain activate when you walk to the front of your house. And you can see they're different. So with that, they're able to communicate. Wow. Because she could she could think about, these, and you see it on the, on the fMRI. So, and this is like the biggest fear. And this is what, the Brandon, so the Brian Edlows and Nico Schiffs of the world who are worried about taking care of patients in the States.
Yeah.
Am I going to pull the plug,
Exactly.
when the person is still there?
Exactly.
And so, like, Brian Edlow, who's at MGH, I mean, these guys work very hard to figure out if something is still connected, or enough is connected between the brainstem and, let's say, the thalamus and cortex, maybe we should go a bit further with this person. I mean, making those calls are extremely hard, but this idea of sort of cognitive motor dissociation, because I can't move, I can't tell you that I'm perceiving it.
Exactly.
So the reason
I
you
can
miss
think of something that you can read.
right, you miss my consciousness because you don't have a way to communicate with me.
Yeah.
That's what it shows.
So Ken, in your paper, you basically argue about these definitions of consciousness, this embodiment, this, sort of, perhaps the sheer number of neurons or the sheer complexity of the neuronal networks or the global patterns of communication and connectivity. So I'm wondering if you could share with us, what are these definitions of consciousness and how many of those are uniquely human? How many of those could be achieved by, I don't know, an embodied version of ChatGPT and so on and so forth? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. There probably are, if you look in the literature, maybe 20 or 30 of these definitions of consciousness that have that people have written about a lot, and there's a lot of detail, but none of them are particularly satisfactory. And everybody, even people immersed in the field, none of them find them all totally satisfactory. So one that gets probably to the early stages of these more definitional approaches to consciousness was a paper that Francis Crick wrote on his deathbed. Maybe some of you know it, and which he wrote together with Christoph Koch, in which he claimed that consciousness was in the claustrum.
In the
claustrum, the part of the brain that actually it's just below the cortex. It forms a sheet-like structure, and they like it a lot because it is widely connected all through the cortex. So, and that gave rise to broader theories that fall into this general category of what are called neural correlates of consciousness. That is, are there regions of brain that you can remove and lose consciousness? And it turns out that's really hard to say. It's just because you remove something like the locus coeruleus or an activating center doesn't mean that's the cause of consciousness. So those arguments tend to have a lot of trouble. And then there's ideas where you get these sort of higher order types of definitions in which people say that you need to have not just primary sensory cortex, but you need association cortex to actually now kind of activate consciousness. So if you, some of you may be familiar with this condition called blind sight. So here's a person who can walk around. They don't walk into the pole. They don't miss anything. So they're able to navigate. But if you ask them what is around them, they don't have a clue. They're not aware. They don't have a consciousness of their visual environment, even though they're processing it quite appropriately. And if you look at the activation of their brain, which is one of the bases for these hypotheses around the higher order theories, is that those individuals tend to activate just the primary sensory area of the visual cortex, striate cortex, and a lot of the association areas are not activated. So somehow these ideas of consciousness that consciousness emerges as you begin to integrate at a higher level the primary sensory inputs. And so this then leads to another type of idea that has been referred to more that a related idea in which that there is what they call ignition, that not only do you have to involve these other areas of cortex, but you have to actually, there's some process that begins to ignite them. So all of the, by the way, everything I'm saying here, if there are neuroscientists in the room, none of this is particularly satisfactory for a neuroscientist. I haven't said anything molecular. I haven't said anything particularly physiologic. So this is why I started by saying that most of the theories of consciousness leave, I think, most people a little bit unsatisfied. So, but they're very global, and and they're phrased in very nice ways, and they tend to have some sort of like intuitive appeal. Then along came another theory which actually did not require the brain anymore at all, and that is called IIT, and it's called integrated information theory. And in this case, this has been quite interesting. It's gotten a lot of attention. It's that that you need to define a state, and you might put that state into some sort of a matrix that would be, and maybe it's a state of where everything is in the room, and that's the state of the room. And then you then start to run time across the state. So you now have what's called a transitional matrix, that you can move the matrix from the future time or to a past time. And the way and the idea here is that if you could actually generate a function for how all these states are moving, now you begin to understand how these transitions are working. And if you think about all these transitions, they're all working internally. This is these kinds of, this minimal amount of information, which is what IIT is going after. They call it phi. It's the number, they put a number on this. At the end of the day, there's going to be a number. So you have all these transitional states. You look at how they functionally transition, and you can draw it out as a graph with edges, and you put values on them, and eventually you try to do an operation on that transitional matrix that says, how many of all these different edges can I remove and still retain the integrated information? And so so now you could take that mathematical approach, which and compute a number, and you can use it for anything. You can say, I'm going to compute that number for a brain, which is very hard to do because you don't know all the states, but people claim that there's ways of doing it. I'll speak to that in a moment. And or you can do it for ChatGPT. You can say there are these different states. And so people that sort of lean toward IIT explanations are no longer constrained by the fact that consciousness is a unique property of the brain. They would say that the consciousness basically requires some sort of materiality. A brain is a material thing, and that it's possible to conceive of the fact that other material entities, like the sun, might achieve consciousness. And so there's a slippery slope here toward panpsychism when you start to compute things this way. I'll just say one more thing about this. For these individuals that are in this minimally conscious state, that when you ask them, how do you, do you serve with your left or right hand, and they activate the appropriate motor area, and even though they're in complete coma, this technique IIT is actually there's a study being done right now to see if you can use IIT to address whether those individuals are conscious. And the way they're doing it is they use transcranial magnetic stimulation to actually activate the brain and set up a whole bunch of states. And then you run the clock and you say, okay, now the state was like this, how did it change? And you can compute a phi value, and phi value is a positive number that can go, as high as you want. At a certain cutoff, you would then be able to use a relatively simple technique, just transcranial magnetic stimulation, to conclude that the individual may or may not be conscious. I'm not advocating for that, but you asked, what are the theories that are in?
So Emery, if you were to sort of think about the building blocks of human-like consciousness, what would be those building blocks?
I mean, I think we've talked about them, but I think the allegories keep us honest about how big the problem is, right? So another one I was just thinking about was when you have patients who have out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences. So coming to the emergency room, cardiac arrest, they're working to resuscitate, and the person is sitting up here, sees everything, and relates exactly what happened when they had that, when the arrest took place, and how, and what person A said the person B, and that sort of thing. Where is that? I mean, that's not just here.
In a way, you continue being aware of the surroundings, but you lose the embodiment, and that's sort of this non-personal, non-first person view of the events.
But we all realize those are real. They've happened to people, and they're well documented.
Yeah.
Or another example, one which we actually create in the operating room, is we do total circulatory arrest. So if you have to do surgery where you have a very complicated aneurysm, and the neurosurgeon doesn't want any bleeding whatsoever, or if you're operating on the major vessels coming out of the aorta, you have to stop the heart, and you have to stop blood flow, and you have to stop ventilation. So what they do is they cool the person's anesthetized, they cool them down to, I think it was 28 or 18 degrees Celsius, 18 degrees.
Still warmer than Boston.
Right. And then, so the heart stops, there's no breathing, there's no blood flow. And they have about 30, 45 minutes to operate to get this done.
Wow.
And then
Why so little? Because after that, the brain atrophies basically.
you risk the tissue dying.
Yeah, got it. Yeah.
But let's ask the question, during that time, when the person is just there, and you've turned everything off, where are they? Where is that person? Because now look, if all the people, we were talking about this earlier today, if all the people just went home, that guy's dead, right?
Oh yeah, that's true. Gosh, so
Totally dead.
Yeah.
But,
Wow.
you slowly warm him back up.
Unbelievable.
And then
our state.
you see the heart start to beat again,
Unbelievable.
right? You can ventilate the lungs. So you basically killed them. And the person who talked the most, who's talked about this, Ken and I were talking about this earlier today, Sanjay Gupta has a good book on this called Cheating Death.
Yeah.
And there's a out-of-body experiences in it. But there's another, the story in the opening chapter is about this medical student who's up in Norway. And she is working in an emergency room in Norway. And she goes out and gets caught in an avalanche. And they find her and they bring her in. She's cold. All right, she's totally cold. And the EW doc, the guy who ran the EW, decided that what he was going to do was warm her up very gradually over several hours, many hours. He had been trying to do this before, and he tried to warm people up quickly.
They died.
And they died. So he warms this woman up just very, 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 very gradually. She survives. After everything was all said and done, she just had a limp in one of her legs, basically. She was dead.
So, I think this is a good point.
This is the Monty Python sketch. Just
Yeah.
stress it. Just
This is a good time to open this up because we had this conversation a little bit before.
Yeah.
And I would say that when the person had the out-of-body experience and when everything was shut off, it was still coming from their brain. I mean, I would like to know if you or anybody here thinks that that consciousness can exist outside the brain, human consciousness, your consciousness. I mean, or are all of us such materialists that the only place where everything we're talking about among humans, let's not talk about.
I did venture to include the word soul in the
Well,
announcement.
that's what I'm getting at.
I did include that. Very explicit.
But I mean, that's sort of where it's going. What you're saying is,
Right.
And so does that person have the out-of-body experience? I mean, are you concluding that there was something that was really outside of their physical existence?
So my interpretation was that they were perceiving the events in a more factual way without the first person experience. And that's why I described what you were saying as a sort of non-embodied.
You have some IU.
Some
You have to have some input.
Input, output,
All those
yeah.
is input output. So
Yeah.
if you are all those things you're experiencing is experiencing your senses. So where's the IO coming from? If you see something from outside.
very good point.
Exactly.
So are they like are their eyes open, for example?
They're dead. They're getting.
But the out of body experience is not. I'm talking about the frozen.
The out-of-body experience, they're getting resuscitated. Someone's pumping on their chest. Someone's shocking them. Bring them back. Right?
So is it auditory?
Be open to see something. I mean,
Well, the question might be like,
I know, but have anything to do with it.
is there
Auditory,
something
I mean,
in
it
the
could be
room that you
auditory.
see?
Memory, just your memory. You can have shut off all your senses and still bring out your.
Well, then you're getting into soul territory, and I don't know how comfortable I am with that.
So in case of those out of body experiences, is there
Maybe.
where they ask like, is there something in the room you were able to see that you couldn't have seen from where you were and you didn't get to see afterwards?
I can't say that I know that they asked them that question.
I mean, that
But
would
what
be-
I do know is they've given very detailed accounts of everything that was going on, the conversations that went back and forth between the
But it
people.
could still be auditory.
Right, they could have.
Basically, what you're
perceived it
saying is that
from
there's
their-
no brain signal during that time.
Right, exactly. The EEG's flat.
Okay,
Oh.
well. Okay, if anybody has a good explanation, go for it. I don't. All right, so I would say let's start on this side of the room and we're gonna go that way. So Pete.
So, a simple question. If you put somebody in an fMRI machine and Emery infuses propofol in them and they're knocked out, what do you see on the fMRI?
So we've done that.
Yeah.
And the actually the first time we did it was in the early 2000s. And we were so happy with what we were seeing, we forgot the woman's blood pressure was going down. I mean, it's like amazing. We saw these huge sloths come across just as if in a very, very, like you see in patients in coma or what have you. That's what we saw. And in this particular experiment, we were trying to activate the auditory pathways. And one of the things that we learned was that the auditory pathway was being lit up all the way up to the thalamus, but it wasn't going from thalamus to cortex. Now, and so saying that, you go, oh, well, actually, we already knew that because Hoover and Weasel, right? They did all their experiments under anesthesia, and they were still getting very active signals coming from the back of the brain. So sensory information getting in and maybe not getting processed. I mean, that's what we infer from those experiments.
So does that say that there's a seat of consciousness? And are there specific neurons in that region associated with consciousness?
I don't know. I mean, I just, like I said, that's why I like the stories. Because what we have to do is we have to find something that will tie all these things together. And, we were talking about this earlier today, like acupuncture, for example, which can be used for a lot of things. And it works in some people, it doesn't work in other people. And is it a state of mind that makes it working for some group as opposed to another? I mean, I think that so we have to acknowledge the fact that there could be ways in which we're connecting with things outside us that we haven't figured out. I mean, let me just say it that way. I mean, I have to keep my mind open to that. Even though I do something very, very specific, I'm gonna knock you out. That's what I do. But the idea that there's something beyond that, I mean, there's a lot.
So basically, we should be open. You're saying to the idea of a soul, that the humans are one very unique type of extraordinary machine that can be sufficiently complex to embody the. I mean, I don't know how many of you saw the Pixar movie, The Soul, of like this, oh, I'm next.
Why does it have to be just humans?
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
Yeah, because there are a lot of cultures, right,
Yeah.
that believe
Maybe
that
we don't know how to
these-
detect it in animal.
exactly, like, but they
Or
believe
maybe
that-
we'd like to sort of pretend that it doesn't net.
well, but there
I've never heard
are a lot of cultures that believe that there are flows through everything,
Yeah.
and we receive those flows and we communicate with them. I mean,
Yeah.
and it can be communicating in ways that we don't quite understand. I'm still open to that.
You have a question?
It's very, very possible.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
So a question on a point that you've made repeatedly on the association between consciousness and empathy. And I'm asking this because we're talking about what is human, what is animal. I'm kind of thinking about that combination of consciousness and empathy. Is it something that is in fact human? And I'm also thinking of this, frankly, in the context of the beginning and the end of life. We've come back to this again and again. Thinking about my little baby daughter when she was a little infant, and how you were picking up cues as consciousness deepened. Empathy came into being. On the other end of that, thinking about a time visiting a nursing home, a friend of the family who was deep into Alzheimer's. So deep that my parents actually didn't even like visiting him because it was upsetting them too much. He was sitting there with an attendant who was feeding him, eyes glassy, saying nothing, and simply eating, being fed. As I was visiting him, you were saying that you always treat Alzheimer's patients as if they can understand. And I'm sitting there and I'm talking with them, and the attendant is looking at me like I'm an idiot. And I mentioned, Dr. Link, your son had an op-ed in the New York Times today. But that's a fairly abstract concept. His eyes cleared. And he said, eventually, was
This is a monkey stacking on the left, right?
and I said it was actually on corruption in the Chinese judicial system. And he said, uh-oh, Perry's in trouble again. And then this man who could not talk and was drooling into his bib said, would you do me the honor of obtaining a copy of the op-ed and reading it to me? I'm afraid I cannot read anymore. So, no, this was unreal. You go, you steal the thing from the library, you read it to him, and he understood it. And he was profoundly concerned about his son. And here was the crazy part of this whole story. I called his son, of course. By the time he got down, over, he died a month and a half later. But that ability to recover something, consciousness for sure, extraordinary empathy for his son, and then it vanished, right? And I don't understand either the beginning or end of life, but I do know that the extreme conditions and circumstances that you're discussing tell us something. But what is this connection between consciousness and empathy? And to what extent do other creatures have consciousness and empathy?
Well, I mean, like in the fish example I gave you earlier on, I mean, or like in the magpie, or like here, what I think is so cool about what you just told us is that you got the right resonance of things together to bring this man back. Talking about his son, okay, that resonates. You know, talking, telling him stories, and you had the right signal to probe his brain to bring him out.
And it activated.
Exactly. Other people sitting around. Do you want to eat? You had enough. Is it time to change you? I mean,
He wasn't even talking on those matters.
exactly.
It
So
was
for you-
spoon.
So for the empathy, you have to have some abstract sense of what the other person is feeling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the eating the fish, that's a story from Peter Godfrey Smith in a book called Metazoa. Maybe some of you know it. And so while the other fish are watching these little other ones biting them, and some of them bite too much, the fish that's watching will know to avoid that fish. So that's learning.
Yeah.
But is it consciousness?
Yeah.
I mean, it's simply, to me, I don't say, oh, the other fish is thinking that fish who's getting too many bites must be feeling a lot of pain right now. And that I really think I'm going to avoid that pain. I think somehow the fish that's watching is detecting some sort of squiggle or movement that says, I have to avoid that.
Again, a simpler interpretation, even without the self-awareness, is that a very basic evolutionary need is to be able to identify enemy from like unsafe from safe.
Yeah.
And then watching, like, ignore the fish that's hurting. Just watching different types of fish attack or not attack could be one of those basic functions that you have a mental state.
Which doesn't require, well,
It doesn't require even stealth.
I don't know if you have a mental state. You just simply have learned something.
Exactly. You basically like define different types of behaviors as attacker or non-attacker,
Right.
and then you avoid the attacker ones.
I mean, empathy at its basic level is an emotion. It's not even conscious, right? You see a individual of the same species or tribe feeling pain, and you physically feel their pain.
I mean, speak for yourself.
Without just by looking at it. Sorry.
I'm saying speak for yourself.
Unless you're in that 2% of.
Question.
Yeah. So basically, I'm trying to go left to right, but I'm happy to go anyways. Why don't you go first? And I just want to first acknowledge Sarah and Kat, who have been, instrumental in sort of helping organize this salon. So go ahead.
These are so wonderful.
These out-of-body experiences when neural activity is suppressed, other cells in the body just start behaving like neurons.
Great idea.
So what the out-of-body experience is what's behaving with neurons?
Well, other cells, I've heard that like for C. elegans, people will try to model the neurons in the brain, but that actually like cells in the body are influential to this process and that it's not so simple. So I could imagine that maybe these out-of-body experiences are being stored in the rest of the body.
Are you thinking about astrocytes, etc., or are you thinking about sort of, I don't know, gut cells, etc.?
I'm not sure. I mean, it's not my field of study, but it seems more plausible than
Well, the gut is lined with many neurons that you have in the spinal cord.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Aren't those
Chemical
anatomize
memory.
also?
Say it again.
The intestinal neurons, don't those also shut off when under anesthesia?
Of the gut.
Do the intestinal neurons in the gut?
Yeah, if you, depending on what you give, yeah. The answer is yes. Because in fact, sometimes the surgeons, if the gut is moving while they're trying to operate, they can't operate. So we can give something to stop the gut. So that's totally good.
Other questions?
So my question is exactly about emotion. So in your study, where does emotion start? Or is that just the category difference in category between emotion and consciousness, or is emotion actually something, independent from consciousness that might exist without consciousness?
I mean, that's a great question. I think some of these things are built up. Like, for example, we have systems are fight or flight response, right? It's like, if we don't get out of here right away, I'm going to be eaten up. The bear's going to get me. I have to bring my heart rate and blood pressure up. But thinking about thinking about like empathy, for example, we see mother animals take care of their little ones. Like, there was a YouTube video that was on the other day of this bear with her two cubs, and she's looking through this window, this glass window. It's freezing outside. There's a guy in there. She's basically telling him, "Dude, let us in because we're freezing." She feels for her cubs, and she feels herself, and she feels her cubs must be feeling something like, and she sees a solution, which is to get this human to let me in his house. And I think that those examples are like some of the most powerful. There has to be empathy there. There just really has to be.
But what about more basic emotions,
so one of
like
the,
happiness or sadness?
So Antonio Damasio distinguishes between feelings and emotions.
Right.
And so emotions are something that, like, if you're you get an emotion because now for some physical basis, because you're scared and your heart is racing. Or maybe it can go the other way. Your heart starts racing, and now the emotion is coming from the heartbeat, but what's happening now is that the feeling of nervousness comes from you. So nervousness, the feeling part is the abstraction. That's the part of that's the sentience. The emotion is simply a physiological phenomena that's going with from heartbeat or hunger or any of the things going on in the body.
I think you were kind of saying this as an aside, but I think it brings up a good point. Like psychopaths might not feel any empathy at all, but you couldn't really say that Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't conscious. So I guess, buy that there's an association between empathy and consciousness.
I tell them, I think, as you pointed out already, that consciousness, we go through a lot of different categories to say that some organism is conscious, and empathy is just one of them. And but empathy is really a derivative here. It's a derivative from the fact that you are feeling what another person is feeling. So Dahmer, although he was a cannibal, still had some sense of the abstraction of what he was doing. He still could abstract, I would think.
I
wanted to ask, since the whole idea of consciousness is such a high dimensional thing, what if it's just a matter of interfacing in the right way to understand whether it's uniquely human or like other like
Interfacing with what?
like in the way that we are like three-dimensional and we're not able to understand what happens in like many more dimensions. In the same way, you can like interface in the correct way in order to understand the parameters that make another species consciousness, what it is. That's the
So that's another one of the ideas behind consciousness, is that you require an agent. And the agent has to interact with the environment in some way. And it's through the interaction now that you achieve some level of consciousness. It's just intrinsically alone, without having some sort of feedback with the environment, you would not be able to achieve consciousness. I think that's really on the right track.
Work at a university department with a lot of students, and a pretty big chunk of them are dealing with depression and anxiety. So you made a comment earlier, and then we could kind of change topics about SSRIs. I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Right. So I think psychiatrists have known for a long time that SSRIs are not the most effective therapy for depression. And in fact, they're not the most effective therapy. Low percentages, 20% may be successful.
Wow.
And
20% above placebo.
Thank you. But that's what it is. And for the people who work, it's great.
That's
Right.
right, that 20%.
What I was going to get to was what anesthetics tell us about that. That was the point I was going to make. And that's why I went back to ECT. And you see this very gross change in brain activity. Then the brain comes back and works like it was. That's what anesthetics do. In fact, there's evidence now that all the anesthetics that are used, that we commonly use in the dog, can be used to treat depression in some form of that. And one of the benefits of that, which I was going to mention earlier, was ECT is great because it's helped a lot of people. But one of the things that happens with it is a short-term memory loss.
Right? I know someone who has been through ECT, as we described it. It has been sort of just transformative.
Right, exactly. It's great. But suppose you could do it without the short-term memory loss. And suppose all you're really doing is defibrillating the brain. Right?
Like a reset.
Right. And that's what, and I see this all the time in operating room, the person's awake, then they go into this state and they stand for 3 or 4 hours. I turn the anesthetics off and go back to the other state. I mean, maybe that's all you need is some changing of the circuits. We can't describe exactly what that is yet, but like some of these techniques that Ken assigned like transcranial simulation may help us understand that and make it more precise. But grossly changing the brain dynamics, one, that gives us unconsciousness. That's how anesthetics work. But also, it may be a therapy in some cases, and we've known that for years.
Is there evidence of people after surgery, after being expressing, having less depression?
Well, I'll tell you.
If they fix you.
The one case where I see it, the one case where I see it most consistently, and it's actually a good case because there's not a lot of surgery going on. When people get propofol for colonoscopies, right?
Can you say that again?
When they get propofol for colonoscopies to sedate them, right? They get up and they go, "Wow, that was good."
Propofol alone doesn't do it. So you
They'll say, what did you give me? Can I come back next week? So it is.
All right.
Can you also talk about ketamine because it's related to this whole thing and you are like
Yeah.
Right. So
It's important.
there's been ketamine wasn't the first anesthetic to be used to look at depression. The first one was actually isoflurane, back in the mid 80s. And the what this anesthesiologist noticed his name is actually Bob Langer, by the way. Well, not our Bob Langer, but anyway, he noticed that deep states of anesthesia, the EEG, look like the seizure, the post-ictal period in ECT. And so what he did was he just said, okay, I'll just give people high dose anesthesia for a while and see what happens. And he had comparable results. And then what happened was some people came along after and did some very sloppy experiments. And so that kind of put the thumbs down on it. But the Yale psychiatrists were watching, they were testing psychedelics. This was about 20 years ago. They were testing psychedelics. And they said, well, why don't you try ketamine? And what they noticed is that their patients who had depression were seemingly getting better when they got the ketamine. And so then they did a trial. John Berman, did a trial of it. And then in 2006, Carl Zarate at the NIH did a first real trial of ketamine, and showed clearly that it was effective against treatment-resistant depression. And one of the hardest forms to treat. And again, well, like I said, what I find so interesting is as we tried to sort through, and John Berman's done a lot of work trying to map out what the circuitry is. But if you stand back from it, there's something very gross that you see. You get a reset of the brain. And ECT has been telling us that for years. And with the anesthetics, you have different categories maybe you can pick from to actually pull something like that off. And ketamine, it's really interesting. The dose that you give is 0.5 milligram per kilogram over about an hour or so. And the 0.5 milligram per kilogram, that's a dose I give as a bolus just to treat someone for pain. If they're going to have a painful procedure. Remember one time I had a patient who had he had like a necrotizing wound down the center of his back. And he had to come to the operating room because it was so painful to have his dressings changed. And so they said, maybe we can try to start giving him something so we don't have to bring him down to have the dressings changed. So we pulled out ketamine. So the guy was over like this, his back was exposed. And, showing the operating area of a patient to a surgeon is like saying, sick him to a dog. They're going to hop right on it. And so they were about to start cleaning his back with iodine. And I said, guys, give me a second. Time out. Let me give him something. So I gave him 0.5 milligram per kilogram of ketamine. And then they started cleaning his back with the iodine. He goes, I said, do you feel anything? He goes, no, kind of, not really. That's a dissociation. And other times when you use ketamine like that, it's really interesting what people will tell you. Like this one guy, I gave it to him because he had this really large wound in his perineum that they were closing up. And when I saw the wound, I told the surgeon, hold on a second, let me get some more medication. I went to the pharmacy, it happened to be right there, got some ketamine, and gave him a dose or two. And so he was actually quite sedated during the case. When he came to, he goes, wow, that was a trip. That was a trip. He said it's like the Magical Mystery Tour. That's the Beatles' last album.
Yeah.
I said, well, tell me more about it. He goes, no, I can't. Not right now. He said, my mind is racing too fast. But so get, what I've seen, in the operating with ketamine, it then doesn't surprise me that, it's clearly changing state. Let me just say, I can't be any more precise than that.
This makes me realize just how little we understand of the extraordinary capabilities of our brain. The fact that we spend so much effort trying to tame it, basically. And then you just take out some of the breaks and, so much stuff is possible.
Here's a question in that we have a lot of tools of visualizing and finding things in here. What do you have to advance to get to the next level of understanding the brain from all the tools and this that we have? Like, it should be more precise fMRI, much more high frequent one. What will give you the next big set of information?
That's a good question because we're concerned about trying to do exactly that. And I think that something faster, I'll just say something faster, which allows us to watch the brain at a faster time scale would be very helpful.
Because of the brain waves component.
Just the neuron spiking.
But if you don't have individual neuron spiking, then...
Which the neuron spiking creates the waves, and the waves modulate the spike.
What you can do
Is the resolution good enough? Do you need higher resolution imaging?
No, you need more than that. This is so one thing you can do is with MEG, magnetoencephalography, is actually use this to somehow to induce some mental states. But the problem is that if you want to try to alter these mental states, you have exactly what you're saying. It takes a long time to do the spike sorting that comes out of an MEG. So if you talk about an advance, what's needed is sort of a real-time feedback from these types of techniques like MEG or any of the other things, some of these other implants that people are putting into the brain now, like a whole array of microelectrodes that can actually read. But the feedback is what's really needed. So you can do that now that you measure state, and then you can, based on what the state is, make a change.
The feedback problem in the compute side, though, more
the feedback is in the actually reading out what represents a neural unit. You're basically getting a whole bunch of spiking, but you then have to sort them, and you have to then figure out what actually represents a neural unit. And that's a very time-consuming step right now in MEG and also in ECOG.
It's a compute problem.
It is a compute problem.
And also, but also having an idea of, I agree with you. Having an idea of what you're really looking for, what's the signal that you want feedback to. In other words, if this is pathologic, where do you want to stimulate to make it better? And it may not be in the area where the pathology is occurring.
Yeah.
And that's one of the challenges.
All right, so I'm going to call numbers. So raise your hands. We have 1, we have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Remember your number: 9, 10, 11, 12. All right, go ahead.
I suggest that we might be making a mistake by using a single word, consciousness, to describe a wide range of attributes like self-awareness, ability to plan for the future. Whatever consciousness is, it's surely a graded phenomenon in a continuum. So we know that magpies and dolphins can recognize themselves in the mirror. We know that crows play with each other. It would be like using the word weather to cover rain, snow, hot, cold, many attributes of it. So I think we might be backing ourselves into a corner by just using one word instead of the many different aspects.
Great point.
Yeah. So I think that one outcome of tonight could be, let's schedule a time to sort of figure out what all the words. Yeah. Who was 2? Go ahead.
This is very interesting. I'm just wondering, what do we know of what happened to the brain and the circuit and the signal when people are in deep meditation states? Like if you are so deep that you don't have awareness of your body or the surroundings, so you are there, you are conscious, but at the same time, in a state where you're not. So I'm just curious of what we know about what happens to the brain and the process.
Well, I think that's a fantastic question. And there have been some studies, but not as many as we think on meditators. Because what's so cool about them is that as opposed to the brain controlling us, they can control the physiology. So in the first article about this that I know about came about in 1996, in which they did exactly what we tested. They took a set of Buddhist monks and they put each of them and they measured their brainwave patterns. And you might think they're meditating and chilled out, or don't look all slow and everything. It wasn't. It's actually quite fast, in fact. Then in retrospect, it sort of made sense because they were using their mental powers to control, what the brain was doing. And I think, and we were talking about this earlier, so Bala Subramanian, who was at the Beth Israel, has a consciousness center research center, consciousness research center. It's called the Sadhguru Center, and in which they're trying to study all this, together with anesthesia, with sleep, and everything. I think it's a totally understudied area. And I was talking, Ken and I were talking about this earlier today, and I was telling him that one of my colleagues who is an anesthesiologist, he's originally from India, who was relating me a story that his grandfather saw when he was practicing about one of the yogis who had to have surgery. And so he said, so they said, okay, we have to give you general anesthesia. No, you don't. Because I'll put myself into a trance. And then when I'm in it, just go ahead and operate. I'll bring myself out. That's what he did. So there are these powers there that they haven't even begun last time. And that's why, how do they, that's real mind and body control.
In that context, I want to bring up the placebo effect that we talked about earlier. I tell you that I'm giving you something great, and suddenly you're doing better.
Oh, yeah.
To me, real. Like everyone has that. If the placebo effects exist, it basically it basically means that so many of us have that capability. Well, not all of us, right? To modulate our physical state.
At least what the work of like the yogis teach me is that we have the capacity to control a lot better, but we're not trained to do it.
Yeah,
essentially.
Yeah.
And maybe another it is a very important angle from which we should be studying.
All right, number 3, get ready. I don't remember who it was. No. You go ahead.
Okay, so I wanted to go back to neural correlates of consciousness, because I find that to be an almost nonsensical thing, at least currently in the field of neuroscience. Neural correlates are kind of wild because you have individual neurons that have a signal that you could read from that is meaningful, like, a Jennifer Aniston neuron. But obviously you could remove that neuron. The person still has a concept of Jennifer Aniston that is measurably not possible to say that it's been degraded at all. So what is the actual correct signal? Because you've got single neurons, you've got small microcircuits, larger circuits within a region. You have fMRI, where a single voxel is hundreds of thousands of neurons, if not more. And then you have patterns across voxels within a region. Then you have networks of brain activity within a region across other regions. Then all those more complicated Yo-style networks. What is the actual measurement and signal that we want to understand consciousness?
Actually, if I may just add my question, because it's very related to that. If there's no consensus on neural correlates, and if it's not necessarily an electrical activity or a perfusion-related metric, then how do you is there a consensus that under anesthesia you actually don't have consciousness? Or is that still a topic of debate?
Remember the first thing I said, we're the worst people in the world to ask that. we study the brain piece. It's always an inference. Even it's still an inference. It's an inference I try to make by using EEG, saying, "Oh, I saw everybody else I saw with this pattern was seemingly unconscious, and there were no untoward circumstances for them afterwards. So I'm going to call this unconscious, and I'm going to bring this patient to the same state. So it's still an inference because, like I said, we're talking about the hard problem, figuring out, what conscious is. All I'm doing is just using sufficient condition, basically, to just manage.
How do we disentangle that from a lack of memory about that experience versus consciousness? Like, what if they are actually conscious and don't have recall?
Well, so, I mean, that you're right. I mean, I couldn't distinguish it. And that's why I say it's an inference after a certain point. And like I said, the people who have this cognitive motor dissociation taught us a lot. It just may be that under anesthesia, maybe we should do the tennis thing with them under anesthesia and see if they could, it's on to us. But I think that question is going to continue to be there for a long period of time.
But I think you were asking more about the hierarchies in biology.
Or like what is the signal we want? Because when I think about what is the next advance in neuroscience that would help us the most, is there a way to record at the level of a single neuron all the neurons in the brain at the same time? Then you have a huge dimensionality issue to deal with, but what is that signal that we actually want? Because I used to do fMRI. I didn't even care what a single neuron was doing. I had no way of measuring it. Didn't know what signal it was really contributing.
And if we had neurons, we'd be asking for synapses. And if we have synapses, we'd be asking for, individual proteins within them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do we kind of connect all those levels?
Yeah, and I think this is what IIT does. It tries to look at the circuitry issue here. If I had to put my own bet down on where all these levels are, I think it has to do with the connectivity patterns. And there's an idea in neuroscience called radical localization. So not only is it connectivity, but it's connectivity within certain anatomical regions. So for instance, Carl Disseroff published a paper with ketamine, putting the dissociative state of ketamine into the habenula. Now, I'm sure it's not just the habenula, but there is processing there going on. And just like every other part of the brain has action potentials and synaptic transmission and all of the sort of fundamentals. But how it gets wired, I think, is going to tell us a lot. And that is a very high dimensional problem that we don't have. Somebody said compute. That's the issue right now.
All right, number 4.
So if we consider the part of being conscious or fully conscious as being able to answer the questions, who am I, where I am, it requires some pattern matching that you need to go back to see who you are. Now, given that paradigm, hypothetically, if you're able to keep the brain alive and be able to interface with that, it doesn't seem to be a thing too much of the future, can you preserve consciousness and if at all even transfer consciousness?
Oh, that's a good question.
I think we can. Yeah. But you go ahead.
So there are two things. There's my day job, right? where I'm being very practical and making people unconscious. But then, at night, I realized that maybe there's a deeper connections out there that we're not acknowledging. They go just beyond our sense as individuals. Some of these various experiences that you read about, it's going to be hard to explain in any other way. So I leave at night, my mind is open.
Let me give a more materialist example.
Beyond Dr. Jekyll and Mr.
Yeah. So we already have two consciousnesses, well, the right and left hemisphere. And when you cut the corpus callosum, they don't communicate. You can put something in your right hand and it's being processed in the left hemisphere and you can describe it because the left hemisphere is eloquent. It has language. You go the other way around, you might have some idea that it is like nasty. So you want to get rid of it, but you can't say what it is because it's going to the other hemisphere. How is it that two consciousnesses, I'm using the term loosely, are connected and absolutely seamlessly through the corpus callosum? So the way that another consciousness could be meshed with ours is to create a corpus callosum that goes to another brain. Right. So if I was able to send the corpus callosum has 2 million fibers in it, 2 million axons. If I just sent if we connected, say, with 100 of them, you might have a little bit of an idea of what I'm thinking, and I might have a little idea of what you're thinking. If we get up to 200 million connecting us, we're no longer Ken and Emery. We're now become one person. That's, I think, where the limit that when the brain is connected, similar to the corpus callosum, and it could be two brains. That's when the individuality begins, the boundary of individuality.
Don't we have scientists tweets that have a connection?
Yes.
Each of them is a person, but also they can sometimes recognize.
But that's a great point. We don't know anatomically what's going on within.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thomas?
Yeah, I was number 10, I think, but.
Go ahead.
Let me piggyback on this, but take it to a completely different area. We very much in vogue AI, you start talking about ChatGPT and robots.
Yeah.
Do you think, and that's an open debate, but do you think we will be able, or robots will have a consciousness? And I guess the sub question is, can we create consciousness so that we give it to the robot?
Yeah, I think they will be, and here's why, because we already know that consciousness is a material thing. That's at least my opinion. So there's no hypothetical reason why another material thing could not be created in some other way of mixing something that does something similar to what the brain does with whether it's silicon or whatever, that could actually end up being conscious. The real issue becomes what Emery said, the hard problem. That is, how do you know that other entity is conscious?
No, so that would be an interesting study.
I really think so. If you go ahead.
It exhibits idle curiosity of some.
So I had a question. So currently there's some labs doing research on growing organoids, but using them as computers. I don't know if you've seen much about that, but so what do you think of that in terms of like the organoids being able to have this emerging consciousness with their computing power, and what are the ethics of that as well?
And so I'm particularly interested in being able to use organoids as a way to, the brain runs on 20 watts, right? If organoids could really compute, then maybe we get rid of server farms and just set up like a laboratory. But I mean, this is fantastic.
Not freaky at all.
But it's becoming, I think, increasingly clear that when you look at the physiology of an organoid, there is a lot of very precise temporal organization within there with timings that looks like a clock, with a pool of neurons that are more plastic, in which one could envision they could accept an encoding signal, but they don't now. An organoid is basically a framework. It's like code. It's like it allows you to encode something if there's no experience. It's just a framework for coding. So I would say that if you're going to get to consciousness somehow, you need to be able to embody the organoid in some way that it is able to interpret the experience it's having through all the coding that it already contains.
Beautiful. Next. All right.
I was wondering if for a moment we could explore some hypotheses that could explain that story that Emery shared about the disembodiment memory when the person is unconscious, because that absolutely blows my mind that if a patient is undergoing cardiac arrest, their heart's not beating, their brain's not getting oxygen, they're effectively dead. How is it possible that they can have memory and recollection of the series of events? Where are they in that process?
That's why I brought it up. I mean, I think that keeps us honest. I mean, because we've been talking about very constructive ways in our current framework of thinking about, so somewhat in a Western framework of thinking about, these ideas. But, those examples suggest that this is much broader, has the potential to be much broader than we're giving it credit for. And so, I'd love to know the answer to that. I mean, that to me is the cool problem.
Something I want to convey is that when we use language as a frame to discuss consciousness, it can be misleading because it automatically puts aside so many other, mediums or creatures or structures that cannot have that sort of expression. So, and you mentioned yourself, right? Like if you go down the chain, you know that your dog is aware of an environment. It senses things, has emotions, right? But also we know that there are other humans who are never able to, utilize language because they're born deaf, for example. But they're totally conscious, right? I think that's a problem. Like having language as a frame
is completely misleading. Maybe one way of thinking about it is that, like, you mentioned, and so did Emery, that, Emery mentioned that this sort of like oscillations that disappears. And you mentioned, for example, the blind side, where there is association cortices are not as active as, primary cortices. So I think perhaps we can think of it that there's some sort of like integration of this sort of specialized functions in this system that rise to what we perceive as consciousness in ourselves. But of course, if you have a simpler system, you could have a multicellular system. It is doing something like the environment, it's capturing information, it's utilizing it to have an impact on the environment and self-regulate. So by virtue of that, that system also has that sort of property in a much cruder way. So it's very hard to say why you don't think, for example, your organoids are not conscious. They are maybe, by virtue of that, they are aware of the environment. They're doing something, but it's much cruder. They don't have language. So who cares?
Okay, go ahead.
So as a physicist, the idea of consciousness as a kind of emergent property, which is very complex and depends on every person's kind of particular complex makeup, etc., is not so surprising. But what I'm wondering is how much is consciousness holographic in the sense that, for example, we have memories that are not really there, but which are made up, for example, by the brain needing to kind of fill in some void or something like that. For example, these out-of-body experiences or something like that. And how much could one A, explain out-of-body experiences with that, and B, how much do these kind of pseudo memories make up our consciousness?
I mean, one property of consciousness, we didn't really go into all of them, is what I would call the persistence and consistency. So we have a blind spot. We're not even aware of it, but we fill it in. We don't see behind us, but we're not worried about what we're missing. When you blink your eyes and then you wake up, open them again, the world is still the same. There's both persistence and consistency that is part of consciousness that retains the information that's there. And like you said, fills in a lot of the missing information. Not just, and the filling in is really interesting because that's a place where people fill in different ways. Is a place where there's ambiguity. And that's what the fact that consciousness is opaque to us, when we have all this filling in, it really makes it a challenge to figure out other people. Great.
Yeah, I wanted to get back to animals' consciousness and empathy, and ask you how you would characterize the experience of elephants grieving.
I mean, the way I view it is that we're surprised because we thought we were the higher order organisms, basically. And we start to see these characteristics developing sort of all along the biological trend. It's very real. I mean, the mother elephant is really sad it lost its baby or lost its sister or what have you. I again, we've studied other phenomena in the body by looking at how they develop across, species or what have you. And I think we have to admit that we can do the same thing with consciousness, because there are elements like this, and like the examples I was giving earlier, which are there's clearly emotion, and there's and inference now. There's seemingly clearly feeling. So I think it's that question. I'd like to think about it now too, because we're not giving. We think that it's only us that are capable of this, but we have a lot of neurons in the elephant brain. I'm sure
more than ours.
Right.
But it also seems a collective experience, like among a group of elephants, right? It's not just the mother.
They're very social beings. Right? I mean, so in other words, so that suggests that they're showing empathy, right? That characteristic is developed even in that species. So again, we're not on the top. In other words, all these things didn't begin with us when we said that.
So we thanked Sarah and Kat, but we didn't thank one person who's extremely special and who has been hosting us every time. My wife is just turned 8-year-old daughter, Elora, who has been extremely good listening. But anyway, Lucille, take it away.
My privilege. I would just bring it up to the fact that the last time, or not the last time, we discussed every night on many topics, but previous conversation that involved more than the two of us was about the quantum basis of consciousness. And tonight is about the neuronal basis of consciousness. So quantum, actually, or so I'll open the conversation. You don't have to answer. I know it's late. Everyone wants to go home or.
You have to answer. I'm sorry.
So, debate or a healthy salon on the quantum basis of consciousness and the normal basis of consciousness.
So there's a lot of talk about microtubules having quantum effects, and then there's the Penrose hypothesis of requiring quantum, etc. Like, we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I think there's two questions buried in there, which one of them is that can the brain utilize quantum mechanics?
Yeah. And the answer is obviously yes.
Well, it's not so obvious. Then the other part of that question is that is there some sort of consciousness that exists in a quantum mechanical realm that is outside of the brain or mind or whatever you want to say? So and
the answer is obviously no. I'm kidding.
So, fortunately, somebody already claimed to be a physicist, and there's somebody in the room like that because, Penrose talks about the collapse of the wave function. I don't know if you have more to say about that. But there are a lot of people that are trying to, including some of my colleagues at Google Quantum AI right now that we collaborate with, trying to look for some sort of register of a quantum mechanical phenomena in our case, within an organoid, but in any kind of biological system would be really interesting. And there's no definitive answer on that. The one that comes closest, I think other people in the room can speak better than I can about this, but the one that I think is the most impressive is not so much brain, but in photosynthesis, there may be.
That's what came up during our quantum.
Yes, superposition of an electron over a long distance.
Yes.
Yeah, and you just mentioned the twins or being able to have that not digital twins, but actually that. Could that physically be obtained instead of from the normal basis in people connection or synapse connection, but actually from quantum states?
Yeah, that's going to.
So let's see a few hands again. Last final round. We're going to go up to 5. Go ahead.
I just want to add, and one explanation for the out-of-body experience for people who actually is kind of in coma and not able to see things that they should have not been able to see, like they're able to see, like they should not be able to see when they were in coma, is because they were able to receive certain senses from another side because of that working as a receptor. That's like another explanation for that.
All right, sorry.
Okay, I was interested in the fact that you think that organoids are not conscious. That's correct. That seems to suggest that you have that you have some metric for measuring when an entity is not conscious. And given that we're potentially on the precipice of needing to make really practical decisions about how to treat different entities, firstly, how did you make that decision? And then secondly, would you be able to point to different research directions that you think are most promising for assessing this?
So this little paper that
it was linked, by the way, to your email. So tonight's reading, if you haven't already.
I went through all the main theories of consciousness and could not attribute what an organoid has in terms of its anatomy to any of them, even to IIT, because the way you do IIT right now, we talked about, you need the transcranial magnetic stimulation. The organoid is too small to actually get that to create these transition networks to be able to see if you get a high five. So there's no current existing theory of consciousness that an organoid can explain, mainly because it's so small and it has the anatomy is so bad. For all those reasons, I think that you could not conclude they're conscious.
In the series of thanking people, I just want to say a huge shout out to Mi Young. So this salon was incepted during a dinner that we had with Pam and Harvey Lodge with Mi Young and Ken. And we're like, you know what? We should have a little salon. We should call it.
And Harvey and Pam
who just took off. So Mi Young, thank you again. Last chance for questions, one there, and then we're gonna stop there. So then, no, go ahead.
Oh, I would like to ask if you think consciousness and the effects of anesthesia, they arise at the hardware level or the software level, both from a computer science and neuroscientist and a clinical electrophysiology perspective. And if it arises from the software level, do you think there can be a mathematical expression or formula that can encapsulate what consciousness is that we can potentially replicate in other man-made systems?
So just help me understand. So for the body, what's the hardware? What's the software?
So hardware would be the neurons themselves. So coming back to the brain organoids. Yes. Well, no, I actually for the software I would prefer defining it as the
Neuronal
population activity of the neurons.
Yeah.
And for the hardware, coming back to the brain organoids, are there neurons that are fundamentally different that in humans compared to other living organisms?
I mean, you've done this.
Well, fundamental. I mean, they have DNA, they have synapses, they have all the fundamentals of a neuron, but they have human genes. They have, there are features there that I would feel pretty strongly they're human organoids, so they have human features. But if I don't think any of those features at this time are related to the fact that we can achieve consciousness from them. That would be my just an opinion.
All right, so I don't know if you guys watched The Meaning of Life by Monty Python. Absolutely required to watch. But there's this moment where they arrive after like all of these crazy adventures and misadventures to the end of the film, and it literally says the end of the film. And you basically have this character who's just on a chair and says, "Oh, the meaning of life. Ah, yes, the meaning of life. It's nothing very special, really. Try and be nice to people, avoid eating fat, read a good book every now and then, get some walking in, and try to live together in peace and harmony with people of all creeds and nations." So it's funny that we've basically spent this entire time talking about consciousness. And I was thinking that maybe as the end of the Salon, I can go back to these questions of how does it arise? Is it a defining characteristic of intelligence and reasoning? Is it uniquely human? And basically have ChatGPT's take on this. It's really nothing special. So how does it arise? Oh, it arises from complex neuronal interaction in the thalamocortical system. Is it a defining characteristic of intelligence and reasoning? No, intelligence and reasoning can exist without consciousness. Is it uniquely human? No, many animals exhibit varying degrees of consciousness. What selective forces relate to its emergence? Likely social interaction, survival advantages, sensory motor coordination. Is it explicitly programmed in, or does it arise naturally from large neuronal networks? It emerges from large dynamic neuronal networks rather than being programmed. Does it require embodiment? Not necessarily. Can it be quantified experimentally? Partially, e.g. fMRI. Brain connectivity matters. Is it encoding specific neural circuits? Consciousness involves distributed cortical thalamic circuits rather than a single localized area. How does it relate to the self, the ego, the mind, and the soul? Self. Consciousness enables self-awareness, ego. Higher order consciousness gives rise to personal identity, mind. Consciousness is a subset of cognitive processing. Soul. No scientific evidence. Philosophical interpretations vary. And so on. So on that note, I just want to thank you guys.
Left out the brainstem.
Far from being conscious and far from being perfect. So thank you all. This was fabulous. We had a good time.